The gunshots cracked through the night air like thunder, echoing off wet pavement and brick walls. Marcus Williams, 16 years old, stumbled forward 3 steps before his knees buckled. The plastic bag in his right hand tore open as he fell, sending Skittles and Arizona iced tea clattering across the asphalt in a rainbow scatter of colors that would haunt a city for years to come. Rain drummed against the convenience store windows as the fluorescent lights inside cast harsh shadows on empty shelves. The clock above the register read 11:47 p.m. when Marcus had pushed through the glass doors, hood up against the October chill, $20 crumpled in his pocket, and his mother's grocery list folded neatly beside it. He'd promised Denise Williams he'd pick up milk and eggs on his way home from basketball practice. The Skittles were his own addition, a small rebellion against the diet his coach had prescribed. The neighborhood around Henderson's Market had seen better decades. Boarded windows gazed blindly from apartment buildings that once housed thriving families. Streetlights flickered intermittently, casting pools of yellow that barely pushed back the darkness. But this was home to Marcus. These cracked sidewalks had taught him to dribble a basketball. These corners had witnessed his first steps, his first words, his first heartbreak when Jenny Martinez moved away in 8th grade. Margaret Patterson lived in the only gentrified house on Oakwood Street, a Victorian restoration that stuck out like a sore thumb among the weathered row houses. She'd moved in 6 months earlier, bringing with her a sense of entitlement that the longtime residents found as invasive as kudzu. Tonight, she stood at her kitchen window, peering through designer blinds as Marcus emerged from the store. "That's him," she whispered into her phone, though no one was listening yet. Her manicured finger traced the glass as Marcus adjusted his hood against the rain. "That's definitely him." The 911 call came in at 11:52 p.m. Officer Sarah Chen was 5 minutes into her break, coffee cooling in her cruiser's cup holder, when the dispatcher's voice crackled through her radio. "Unit 47, we have a suspicious person report on Oakwood Street. Caller reports a black male, approximately 6 feet tall, wearing dark clothing and a hoodie. Matches description of armed robbery suspect from last week's bolo." Chen set down her coffee and reached for the radio. "Unit 47 responding. ETA 2 minutes. What she didn't know was that Margaret Patterson had embellished. The original bolo described a suspect as 5'7" with distinctive facial tattoos. Marcus Williams stood 6'2" with clear skin and a honor roll certificate in his backpack. But Patterson saw what she wanted to see, filtered through assumptions that had been growing like poison in her mind since she'd started watching the neighborhood change around her pristine property values. Marcus walked slowly, in no hurry to get home. His mother worked double shifts at Memorial Hospital, and the house would be empty until her break at 3 a.m. He pulled out his phone to text his girlfriend Keisha about tomorrow's homecoming dance, thumb moving across the screen as raindrops spotted the device. The police cruiser's headlights swept across him first, bright white beams that made him squint and raise his free hand to shield his eyes. Officer Chen stepped out of the vehicle, her partner, Officer Rodriguez, emerging from the passenger side. Both had their hands near their weapons, but not drawn. "Stop right there." Chen's voice cut through the rain. Marcus looked up from his phone, confused. "Me?" "Put your hands where we can see them." Rodriguez was already moving to flank Marcus, his training kicking in automatically. But training for what, a 16-year-old walking home with candy? Or the phantom armed robber that existed only in Margaret Patterson's imagination? Marcus raised both hands, his phone in his left, the plastic bag of snacks in his right. "Officers, I was just walking home from the store. I live on Maple Street, just 3 blocks from here." Chen studied him through the rain. Something felt off about this call, but protocol demanded caution. We received a report that you match the description of a robbery suspect. We need to search you. A robbery suspect. Marcus's voice cracked slightly. He was tired from practice, wet from the rain, and now being treated like a criminal for buying snacks. Officer, I haven't robbed anybody. I was at basketball practice until 10:30. Coach Williams can verify that. He's my uncle. Rodriguez moved closer, his hand now resting on his service weapon. The kid seemed nervous, which could mean anything or nothing. In the darkness and rain, details were hard to make out. The hood cast shadows over Marcus's face. The plastic bag crinkled in the wind. Turn around and put your hands against the wall, Rodriguez ordered, gesturing toward the brick facade of a nearby building. Marcus hesitated, not from defiance, but from the same instinct that makes anyone pause when their life suddenly takes an inexplicable turn toward the surreal. 2 hours ago, he'd been practicing free throws. Now he was being treated like a criminal in his own neighborhood. That hesitation lasted exactly 2 seconds. But in those 2 seconds, Officer Rodriguez saw threat where there was only confusion. His hand moved from resting on his weapon to gripping it. Chen noticed the movement, and her own adrenaline spiked. Hands against the wall now. Rodriguez's voice had shifted from professional to aggressive. Marcus took a step backward instead of forward. Another hesitation. Another misread moment that would replay in courtrooms and news reports, and his mother's nightmares for years to come. He's reaching for something, Chen called out, though Marcus was doing nothing more threatening than trying to keep his balance on the slick pavement. The first shot came from Rodriguez's weapon at 11:57 p.m. The second came 3 seconds later from Chen's gun. Both officers would later claim they feared for their lives, that the suspect appeared to be reaching for a weapon, that the lighting was poor, and the situation escalating rapidly. Marcus Williams fell forward, his phone skittering across wet concrete, the skittles creating a colorful constellation around his body. The Arizona iced tea can rolled into the gutter, its metallic clang echoing long after the gunshots faded. Margaret Patterson watched from her window. Her 911 call finally connected to an operator who was asking her to describe the suspicious activity. "Ma'am, are you still there? Can you describe what the suspect is doing now?" She looked down at Marcus's still form and felt something cold settle in her stomach. I think the police are here now. I think they've got it handled." She hung up without giving her name. The ambulance arrived at 12:03 a.m. Paramedics working frantically over Marcus's body, while Chen and Rodriguez stood 20 feet away, their weapons holstered, their reports already beginning to form in their minds. Protocol demanded they separate immediately after a shooting to ensure their testimonies remained uncontaminated. But they both knew they'd tell the same story, a suspicious subject who failed to comply, who made sudden movements, who forced their hands. At 12:15 a.m., Marcus Williams was pronounced dead at Memorial Hospital, the same hospital where his mother was working the night shift in the cardiac intensive care unit. Denise Williams was checking on a patient with a heart arrhythmia when her supervisor appeared in the doorway with an expression that mothers learned to dread. The news didn't break until morning, but by 6 a.m., the story was spreading through social media like wildfire. Unarmed teen shot, dead by police while walking home from store. The hashtags began immediately. Your justice for Marcus. Say his name. Black Lives Matter. By noon, the first protesters had gathered outside City Hall. By evening, the crowd had swollen to over 300 people carrying signs and chanting Marcus's name. The mayor, Patricia Hancock, called for calm and promised a thorough investigation. But calm was not what the community wanted. They wanted answers. They wanted justice. They wanted to understand how an honor roll student buying candy could be seen as a threat worthy of deadly force. The official police report, released the next morning, painted a picture of a dangerous encounter with an uncooperative suspect. It mentioned Marcus's height, his dark clothing, the poor visibility conditions. It noted that officers felt threatened when the subject failed to comply with commands and appeared to reach for an object in his waistband. What it didn't mention was that Marcus Williams had no criminal record. It didn't mention that he was 3 weeks away from his 17th birthday. It didn't mention that he'd been accepted early admission to State University on a partial basketball scholarship. It didn't mention that the object he appeared to reach for was a cell phone with a cracked screen and a photo of his girlfriend as the wallpaper. The first crack in the official narrative came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Chen, no relation to Officer Chen, owned a small restaurant across from Henderson's Market. Her security cameras, installed after a break-in the previous year, captured everything. The footage showed Marcus walking calmly from the store, hood up against the rain, moving at the pace of someone in no hurry. It showed him looking at his phone, typing a message. It showed the police cruiser arriving and the officers approaching with weapons drawn. And most damning of all, it showed Marcus's hands clearly visible throughout the encounter, holding nothing more threatening than a plastic bag and a smartphone. Attorney David Kim received the footage on a thumb drive delivered anonymously to his office on Thursday morning. Kim had built his reputation defending civil rights cases, and he recognized gold when he saw it. By Thursday afternoon, he was standing on the courthouse steps with Denise Williams beside him, her eyes red from 3 days of crying. This video shows an execution, Kim told the assembled reporters. A 16-year-old honor student was gunned down for the crime of walking while black. The officer's statements don't match the physical evidence. Someone needs to be held accountable. Denise Williams stepped to the microphone cluster, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of every mother's worst nightmare. My son was a good boy. He helped elderly neighbors carry groceries. He volunteered at the community center. He was going to college. He was going to be somebody. And now he's gone because a woman who doesn't even know this neighborhood decided he looked dangerous. The protests that had started small were now drawing thousands. National media descended on the city. Cable news shows debated the case nightly. Social media erupted with demands for justice. The video, released publicly that Friday, went viral within hours. Mayor Hancock found herself at the center of a national firestorm. Her office phone rang constantly. Protesters gathered outside her house. Cable news producers demanded interviews. The FBI announced they were launching a civil rights investigation. But the real earthquake came when investigative reporter Sarah Martinez began digging into Margaret Patterson's background. Martinez had covered dozens of police shootings over her career, and she'd learned that the initial 911 call often held the key to understanding how situations spiraled out of control. Patterson had been reluctant to speak to reporters, claiming she was too traumatized by witnessing the shooting. But public records told a different story. In the 6 months since moving to Oakwood Street, Patterson had called 911 17 times. Suspicious person walking through the neighborhood. Suspicious car parked on the street. Suspicious individuals talking loudly on the sidewalk. Every single call involved black residents of the neighborhood going about their daily lives. Martinez's investigation revealed that Patterson had moved to Oakwood Street specifically because property values were low, with plans to flip houses and profit from gentrification. She'd complained to the city council about elements in the neighborhood that were detrimental to property values. She'd started a Facebook group called Oakwood Safety Watch, that residents later described as thinly veiled racial profiling. The revelation that Marcus Williams had been killed because of a serial caller who saw threats in mundane activities shifted public opinion decisively. Even residents who typically supported police found themselves questioning how the system had failed so catastrophically. The City Council meeting on October 23rd was packed beyond capacity. Mayor Hancock had hoped to present a measured response to the crisis, but the community was beyond measure. Speaker after speaker took the podium, each testimony building on the last, like movements in a symphony of outrage. Coach Williams, Marcus's uncle, spoke with the controlled fury of a man trying to hold himself together for his family. That boy never missed practice, never caused trouble. The only thing threatening about Marcus Williams was his jump shot. And now I have to explain to my team why their point guard is never coming back. Keisha Roberts, Marcus's girlfriend, was 17 years old and pregnant with grief. We were going to homecoming together. He was going to wear his father's tie. He texted me at 11:50 that night, saying he was almost home. 5 minutes later, he was bleeding on the street because someone decided his hoodie made him dangerous. Mrs. Patterson attended the meeting, sitting in the back row with sunglasses and a baseball cap pulled low. When her name was called during the public comment period, she walked to the podium on unsteady legs. The room fell silent. I want to say that I never intended for anyone to get hurt, she began, her voice shaking. I was trying to keep the neighborhood safe. The response was immediate and thunderous. Shouts of anger filled the chamber. Someone yelled, "Safe from what, a kid buying candy?" Mayor Hancock gavelled for order, but the damage was done. Patterson's non-apology had revealed exactly what the community suspected. She saw black residents as inherently threatening to her vision of neighborhood safety. As Patterson hurried from the podium, Attorney David Kim rose from his seat in the front row. Ms. Patterson, you'll be hearing from us very soon. The lawsuit, filed the following Monday, named Patterson, the city, and both officers as defendants. Kim alleged wrongful death, civil rights violations, and what legal scholars would later call a pioneering theory of discrimination by proxy. The idea that Patterson's racially motivated 911 call created the chain of events that led to Marcus's death. The federal investigation moved swiftly. FBI agents interviewed witnesses, analyzed the security footage frame by frame, and reviewed Patterson's history of calls. They discovered that the police department had no protocol for handling frequent callers who might be motivated by bias. They found that Officers Chen and Rodriguez had received minimal training in de-escalation techniques. Most damning, they discovered that the original Bolo alert for the robbery suspect had been resolved 2 days before Marcus was killed. The actual perpetrator had been arrested in a neighboring county. The indictments came down in December. Officer Rodriguez was charged with second-degree murder and civil rights violations. Officer Chen was charged with involuntary manslaughter and civil rights violations. Margaret Patterson was charged with filing a false police report and with being an accessory to involuntary manslaughter under a rarely used statute that held civilians responsible for deaths resulting from knowingly false emergency calls. The trials dominated local news for months. Patterson's case went first, and the prosecution painted a devastating portrait of a woman whose racial anxieties had turned deadly. Her Facebook messages, subpoenaed during discovery, revealed a pattern of racist commentary about her neighbors. Her internet search history showed she'd been researching neighborhood demographics and crime statistics obsessively. On the stand, Patterson broke down completely. I was scared, she sobbed. I didn't know the neighborhood. Everything seemed dangerous. But under cross-examination, Kim exposed the hollowness of her defense. Ms. Patterson, in 6 months of living on Oakwood Street, did you ever call 911 to report a white person as suspicious? No, I don't think so. Did you ever attend a neighborhood meeting or community event to get to know your neighbors? No. Did you ever consider that your fear might have been based on assumptions rather than evidence? Patterson couldn't answer. The jury convicted her on all charges. The officers' trials were more complex, involving detailed testimony about police procedures and split-second decision-making. But the security footage was impossible to overcome. The jury could see that Marcus Williams had posed no threat, that he'd been shot for the crime of hesitating when confronted by armed strangers in the rain. Rodriguez was convicted of voluntary manslaughter and sentenced to 12 years in prison. Chen was convicted of criminally negligent homicide and sentenced to 4 years. Both were banned from law enforcement for life. The city settled the civil lawsuit for $4.2 million, one of the largest wrongful death settlements in the city's history. But Denise Williams wasn't interested in just money. She wanted systemic change. Working with community leaders and Attorney Kim, she pushed for the Marcus Williams Police Reform Act, legislation that would require implicit bias training for all officers, create a civilian oversight board for police misconduct, and establish protocols for handling frequent emergency callers who might be motivated by bias. The memorial service for Marcus Williams was held on what would have been his 17th birthday. Thousands attended, spilling out of Greater Baptist Church onto the surrounding streets. The service celebrated his life, his basketball skills, his academic achievements, his kindness to younger kids in the neighborhood, his plans for college and beyond. But it also acknowledged the larger meaning of his death. Pastor Williams, no relation to Marcus, but a longtime community leader, spoke about how one young man's tragedy had forced a city to confront uncomfortable truths about race, fear, and justice. Marcus didn't die in vain if we learn from this. The pastor said, "If we build a world where no mother has to fear for her son walking home with candy, if we create a community where difference is celebrated, not feared, if we remember that every person walking down every street is somebody's child, somebody's hope, somebody's future." The memorial garden was dedicated 6 months later in the empty lot next to Henderson's Market. Community volunteers had transformed the space into a small park with benches, flowers, and a basketball hoop. A simple granite stone bore Marcus's name and dates, along with his favorite quote, "Be the change you wish to see in the world." Mrs. Chen, the restaurant owner whose security cameras had captured the truth, became an unlikely community leader. She started a program called Know Your Neighbors, bringing longtime residents and newcomers together for monthly dinners and conversations. The program spread to other neighborhoods, building bridges across cultural and racial divides. Keisha Roberts, Marcus's girlfriend, spoke at his high school graduation, accepting his diploma posthumously. She was headed to college herself in the fall, planning to study criminal justice. Marcus always said he wanted to make the world better, she said, holding his diploma with tears streaming down her face. "I'm going to do that for both of us." The police department underwent massive reforms. Chief Peterson, who had initially defended his officers, resigned in disgrace. The new chief, an African-American woman with a doctorate in criminal justice, implemented community policing strategies that emphasized relationship building over enforcement. Crime rates actually dropped in the following years, contradicting fears that police accountability would lead to lawlessness. Instead, communities that felt protected rather than policed became partners in their own safety. Margaret Patterson served 18 months in minimum security prison. Upon release, she moved out of state, selling her house at a significant loss. The new owners, a young African-American family with 2 small children, were welcomed warmly by neighbors who had learned the value of genuine community safety built on relationships rather than fear. On the first anniversary of Marcus's death, hundreds gathered at the Memorial Garden for a candlelight vigil. Denise Williams, who had become a national advocate for police reform, spoke to the crowd about the power of collective action to create change. "My son was murdered because someone saw his skin color and assumed criminality," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "But his death wasn't meaningless if it helps us build a world where every child can walk home safely, where every parent can sleep without fear, where every community can thrive without prejudice." The reforms implemented after Marcus's death became a model for other cities grappling with similar tragedies. The Marcus Williams Police Reform Act was adopted in 12 states and influenced federal legislation on police accountability. Young activists across the country invoked his name when pushing for change. "Remember Marcus" became a rallying cry for criminal justice reform, a reminder that behind every statistic was a human being with dreams, fears, and potential. Coach Williams still coached basketball at the high school, though he never quite got over losing his nephew. Every season, he told new players about Marcus, not just his athletic ability, but his character, his dreams, his kindness. The team retired his jersey number, 23, and it hung in the gymnasium as a permanent reminder of excellence cut short. The convenience store where Marcus made his final purchase became an informal community center. Henderson, the owner, started offering after-school tutoring in the back room and job training for teenagers. He kept a photo of Marcus behind the register, not as a shrine, but as a motivation to serve his community better. On quiet nights, when rain fell on Oakwood Street, neighbors would sometimes gather on their porches and remember. They'd remember how fear had nearly torn their community apart, and how tragedy had ultimately brought them together. They'd remember a 16-year-old boy who'd loved basketball and Skittles, who'd been headed to college, who'd never hurt anyone but had been killed for the color of his skin and the assumptions it triggered in a fearful stranger's mind. But they'd also remember how his death had sparked a movement, how his mother had channeled grief into activism, how his community had refused to let his story end in tragedy, how they'd forced their city, their state, their nation to confront uncomfortable truths and make difficult changes. The rain that had fallen the night Marcus died had washed his blood from the street, but it couldn't wash away the memory, the lessons, or the changes that his death had set in motion. In death, Marcus Williams had achieved something that few people accomplish in life. He had changed the world. Years later, when the Memorial Garden was filled with children playing basketball, when the police walked beats instead of driving patrols, when neighbors of all colors gathered for community dinners, when young people could walk home safely at night, then his mother could find some peace in knowing that her son's life, however brief, had mattered immeasurably. The inscription on the memorial stone had weathered but remained clear. Marcus Williams, 2007-2024. He dreamed of being a teacher, a coach, a father, a force for good in the world. His dreams live on in the community he helped create through his sacrifice. May we never forget that every person deserves to walk home safely, to dream freely, to live fully. And in the end, that was Marcus Williams's greatest victory, not the basketball games he'd won, or the grades he'd earned, but the world he'd helped create after he was gone. A world where fear gave way to understanding, where assumptions yielded to knowledge, where justice wasn't just an ideal, but a daily practice. A world where a 16-year-old buying candy would never again be seen as a threat worthy of deadly force. The rain still fell on Oakwood Street sometimes, washing the pavement clean. But it could never wash away the change that Marcus Williams had helped bring to the world, one drop of justice at a time.